Hello all, and welcome to another episode of Movies with My Cat. I'm Nathan, and that's my pal Big Head there, right off camera, as always. Now today, phones are ubiquitous. They're common as a cat, as they say. But when the modern telephone was just getting its start, sometime in the 1880s, 1870s, around there, give or take, a person might have to go well out of their way to get a glimpse at a telephone. I mean, they're gonna have to go next town over, maybe a few towns over to do so. And if you were actually able to use that telephone, you probably had a finite amount of places you could call. It was common for a town switchboard to only have a handful of lines available. Now, some of these lines belong to the very rich, of course, but they also belong to other important public places like the doctors, the law, and probably the taverns and bars and stuff like that. Pretty much. Now, to the general public at the time, the very notion of a telephone was pretty close to real-life magic. And at best, it was marveled at. But at worst, it was feared and wholly distrusted. Of course, in the intervening decades, as telephones became more pervasive in people's lives, it began to lose its mystery. But even a full century after the height of telephone paranoia, some of those same fears were being exploited in the movies. And today, we're going to ring a few of those movies up. So just a few quick clarifications before we get started. First, since Big Head and I cover films from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we'll just be looking at titles from those decades, so there won't be any iPhones or Androids in this episode. Also, this is not a complete list of every phone-based horror movie of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, of course. That's not what we're doing here. These are just a few titles that grabbed our attention. You'll no doubt notice that there are some very good films missing from this list that fall within the criteria. That's partly because Big Head and I, we tend to wade in the shallow end of the cinema pool.
The bitch caused me nothing but headaches since I signed her. I got reporters breathing down my neck. Parents are screaming she's turning little kids into devil worshippers. I don't need the aggravation, okay? The bitch's ass is history. Oh, and tell her I said have a nice day.
So as we mentioned, when the telephone was in its infancy, the public had mixed feelings about it. And there were plenty of people that simply saw the telephone as an extension of the telegraph, which was in use for decades by the 1870s, 1880s, and some people believed the telephone to be nothing more than a novelty item. But the films we'll be looking at aren't the kind that come from such logical thoughts. They're the kind that come from the fear of progress and the fear of the unknown. And those fears ran the gamut from somewhat understandable to seemingly implausible. On the more reasonable side, some people thought that if a person could talk to you without the benefit of eye contact, they'd be able to more easily lie to you. That's why you stay off camera? So you can lie to everyone? That's your lie, that you're a duck wearing a tuxedo? That's your big lie? If we take a look at this illustration from an 1887 Peruvian magazine, it gives us several examples of how one could be manipulated over the telephone. This one shows a guy telling his wife that he's at the post office at the moment, but he'll be home soon to help out with the kids. Of course, he's not at the post office. He's getting his drink on at the bar, and he's not coming home anytime soon because the piano player just hit the opening riff to Oh Susanna. That's his favorite old-timey song. And while that's a pretty selfish and underhanded thing to do, it's nowhere near the deadly manipulation levels that we'll see from what has to be the most common form of telephone terror movie: stalkers and creeps. These are the movies where the protagonist invariably is harassed by an unknown menace via the telephone. They typically ring people up and make various threats or say disturbing, nasty things. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes they just do some heavy breathing, which I actually find a bit more disturbing. Some popular examples of telephone creepers would be the excellent When a Stranger Calls from 1979, starring Carol Kane. It's a classic, and the telephone scenes really do a number on my nerves.
Bobby?
Have you checked the children?
What?
Perhaps an even more obvious example of dangerous, manipulative creeps making menacing phone calls would be Wes Craven's 1996 blockbuster Scream.
Hurry up, okay? Bye now.
If you hang up on me, you'll die just like your mother. Do you want to die, Sidney? Your mother sure didn't.
But again, because of our lesser appreciated policy here at Movies with My Cat, we're going to start with a different movie about a caller terrorizing people who also uses a voice-changing device. And that movie is New Year's Evil from 1981. New Year's Evil is directed by Emmett Alston, and it stars Roz Kelly, who's perhaps best known as Pinky Tuscadero from Happy Days. Roz Kelly plays the part of Blaze Sullivan, and Blaze is hosting the New Year's Eve celebration of LA's favorite new wave TV call-in show, Hollywood Hotline. And the night starts off well enough for Blaze, but it soon takes a sinister turn as she receives a call from a stranger with a strange voice.
Blaze here. A crazy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, Blaze.
Ooh, some kind of voice you got there. Sound like the Phantom.
You could call me that.
So you got a name, Phantom?
Call me Evil.
Evil? You bad, honey?
No. Just evil.
Yeah, sounds like it. Maybe a sip of water. So Evil there, he makes a promise to punish someone for each time zone that rings in the new year, with his last evil deed being done to Blaze there in LA. And he's making good on that promise, taking out both friends of Blaze and random strangers alike. But Blaze refuses to give in to some creep, and she continues to host the evening's festivities, even though that means she has to endure several calls from this evil guy throughout the night. Some of those calls are recordings of his crimes.
Listen to the replay.
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year from New York City.
The police are on the case, hanging out backstage and watching the entrances and exits. But can they do enough to keep Evil from making Blaze his final New Year's sacrifice? New Year's Evil is well worth the watch to find out. And it's not the surprise twist ending that's thrown in that makes it worthwhile. I mean, it's fine, but if I'm honest, you'll probably guess that twist pretty quickly. Rather, the fun is in the mini scenes and references to that time when pop culture was shedding its feathered hairdos of the late 70s to make way for the feathered hairdos of the early 80s. Now, the clothes were bright and busy, while somehow still remaining dull and ugly. And the music was drifting away from punk into new wave, while adult-oriented rock was adding a newly found hard rock element that concerned parents everywhere would confuse for heavy metal. All the while, remnants of disco beats were still lingering like a fart in an elevator. Now, the only thing missing from New Year's Evil that might perfectly encapsulate the time period of this movie would be, let's say, a reference to Eric Estrada's star power. Oh no, wait, we got that too.
I've really enjoyed meeting you. You're a very interesting lady. I kind of hate to go.
You just got here.
I know, I just came in for a drink. I got this business thing I have to attend. There's a big party up at Eric Estrada's place.
Oh yeah, that was definitely a rager, no doubt. I mean, a Eric Estrada party in the early 80s. You think they served chips? Yeah, you think they served a bunch of chips? Because Eric Estrada was in the TV show Chips? Oh yeah, that's probably true. So probably no chips. Well, in addition to being a telephone terror film, New Year's Evil could also be considered a holiday-themed slasher like Black Christmas or April Fool's Day. And on occasion, you'll even see New Year's Evil pop up as an example of a metal-sploitation movie like Black Roses or Rocktober Blood. And while the music on New Year's Evil is better than that, or at least it's just as good as the music from October Blood. It's barely metal, so that might disqualify New Year's Evil from being a metasploitation film, but it certainly belongs on any telephone terror movie marathon you might be planning. By the way, New Year's Evil director Emmett Alston, he also directed the 1988 Bigfoot alien mashup Demon Warp. It's pretty good too.
Come on, you woolly bastard! Come on!
Okay, well, two qualities that can be found in New Year's Evil, and also in 90% of the slashers from the early 80s, are grittiness and mean-spirited violence. But our next entry into the telephone terror genre has enough of those two qualities to make it difficult to talk about while staying within YouTube guidelines, but, we'll see what we can do. And that movie is 1980's Don't Answer the Phone. Oh, right. Don't answer the phone! Because it's got an exclamation point on it. Now, Big Head and I have always maintained that fans of horror might have a stronger threshold for inappropriateness than your average human being. I mean, that goes double for fans of horrors from the 70s and 80s, While most of us probably won't agree with the ignorant language or the antiquated ideas, we can all wallow in and laugh at the moronic nature of all of it, I'd say if you're able to do that, you might be able to enjoy Don't Answer the Phone. Okay. You might be able to enjoy Don't Answer the Phone! Because I can't keep doing that. We got neighbors. We live in an apartment. They're going to get mad. Like New Year's Evil, Don't Answer the Phone is about a maniac terrorizing LA. More specifically, Hollywood. And said maniac also calls into a call-in show, but it's not a new wave dance show. It's a radiotherapist show. Yeah, kind of like Frasier. Now this is Dr. Lindsay Gale, played by Flo Lawrence, and Dr. Gale hosts a segment on KBLA's Dayline. People call in and she helps them with their problems, like this lady with this terrifying problem.
Good morning, you're on the air with Dr. Lindsay Gale.
My name is Kathy. My little boy ties up his toys in ropes and chains and throws them against the wall. Sounds like
a very angry young man.
He also cut up his goldfish with scissors, and he threatened to do the same thing to his little sister.
Don't do that to your goldfish. Right, or your siblings, either. But it's Dr. Gale's next call, which comes from a repeat caller named Ramon, that seems to have the doc especially worried.
Morning, you're on the air with Dr. Lindsay Gale.
Hello, Dr. Gale. Yo soy Ramon. How are you? I called you last week.
Of course, the man with the headaches.
Only that guy, his name isn't Ramon. It's Kirk. And he's played by an actor named Nicholas Worth. And Kirk is responsible for several strangulations in and around Hollywood. And for reasons all his own, Kirk has made it his mission in life to harass and torment Dr. Gale. At one point, even calling her up to make her listen to one of his crimes live on the air.
You hear that, Dr. Gale?
Oh my God.
Meanwhile, Lieutenant McCabe and Sergeant Hatcher, played by James Westmoreland and Ben Frank, respectively, are on the case. Will they be able to stop the killer before the danger goes from over the telephone straight to Dr. Gale's front door? I'm not going to tell you here, but if you can stomach the violent misogyny, the casual racism, and the overall exceptionally mean spirit of Don't Answer the Phone, you can find out for yourself. Don't Answer the Phone's director, Robert Hammer, started off as a photographer and eventually ended up filming concert footage for musicians like Crosby, Stills and Nash and the Steve Miller Band, before deciding to make what would become his one and only film. Initially, while looking for scripts to film, Mr. Hammer came across one that was based on the very freshly committed crimes of the Hillside Stranglers, who were committing their crimes in LA and had been captured less than a year before the production of the film would start. And while the original title was supposed to be The Hollywood Strangler, to mimic the real-life crimes of the Hillside Stranglers, Robert Hammer decided to mix it up a bit, and he rewrote the script to not follow the real-life events so closely. And then executive producer Michael Towers insisted that the title be changed to Don't Answer the Phone, to piggyback on the recent success of When a Stranger Calls. Despite this decision to move away from the real-life events of the Hillside Stranglers, the production still utilized the expertise of a man named John Green, who was an actual member of the task force responsible for tracking down Kenneth Bianchi and Angela Buono, aka the Hillside Stranglers. As it turns out, John Green was a regular consultant on several films as a law enforcement expert. And many times he also just worked on the production of films as a security guard of some sort, you know, security expert, keeping an eye over the craft service table. And as such, on occasion, he was even given a small role in the films he was providing his services for, including Don't Answer the Phone. You can see him briefly in the scene here playing Detective Green. And also, weirdly enough, in our previous entry, New Year's Evil, where he played, that's right, a cop named Officer Green.
Cheyenne. So this is Lieutenant Clayton and Sergeant Green, LAPD.
Now, I'm assuming John Green was the reason why there was some small details included in Don't Answer the Phone that mirrored the actual Hillside Strangler case, such as the useful but still largely ignored psychic that was brought in. In the Hillside Strangler case, it was a psychic from Berlin that correctly assessed, among other things, that it wasn't one perpetrator committing these crimes, but two, and he also claimed they were related. And as history would eventually find out, Kenneth Bianchi and Angela Buono, the Hillside Stranglers, were cousins. While that psychic was from Berlin, I'm not sure where Don't Answer the Phone psychic was from.
A man grabs her. He's a big man. He has short curly hair, like little wires.
The acting in Don't Answer the Phone ranges from fine to pretty good, but for me, Nicholas Worth as the main baddie, Kirk Smith, is the reason you're going to want to sit through this movie. He's nothing short of amazing. Massive in size and massively entertaining every time he's on the screen. A stage actor and amateur powerlifting bodybuilder, Nicholas Worth was the perfect human being to play the emotional, unstable, stalking creep in Don't Answer the Phone. And when it came time to emote, he did so maniacally.
You thought you could beat out of this white mother. Big mistake. No. You.
So it's no surprise that when it came time for him to smash and bash, he did so with equal gusto. That was actually him throwing a man. Interviewed later in life, Nicholas Worth, while still being happy to have worked on the film, expressed some regret about the violence his character portrayed towards women. In an attempt to make the Strangler more interesting than just some guy getting stabby, you know, and then the scene just ends, Nicholas Worth decided to improvise quite a bit, behaving in a way and saying things he felt were properly unhinged. It's what keeps Don't Answer the Phone from being just another gratuitous slasher making waste of topless victims. Yeah, it is. Make no mistake, while occasionally funny in a ludicrous way, when the vitriol hits, it goes hard. Before each victim is brutally assaulted, we're shown scenes of them living their lives in an extraordinarily relatable way. On the phone with their parents, reassuring they'll get together soon, or leaving their therapist's office having made a positive breakthrough, or just being kind and sweet and vulnerable before the Strangler violently snuffs out that light, all the while trying his best to ensure that their last moments alive are as terrifying as possible. When you couple this constant theme with the guerrilla-style filming, as most of the shots out on the street were done without permits or permission of any kind, and you drop that soundtrack on top of it all, the grittiness of this film is undeniable. Yeah, let's hear some of those gritty tunes. I don't know. That's some gritty tunes right there. Don't Answer the Phone knows what kind of film it is, and it dives in head first. It's got a bad guy that's truly scary, and not just because of his imposing size and his proclivity for violence, but because of his truly unhinged behavior. If you can stomach the meanness of it all, Don't Answer the Phone is worth your time. Alright, well, if being harassed by one stranger on the telephone was a concern, imagine the trouble you could run into with a whole bunch of strangers. People of a certain age will remember the 976 chat lines of the late 80s and early 90s. They were all over late night television. If it was after 10 p.m. and you were watching something with commercials, chances are at least one of them was for a late night chat line. These 976 lines could be for a number of services, like, let's say you really want to talk to Kit, the car from Knight Rider. There was a line for that.
Hi, I'm Kit from the TV series Knight Rider. These are my friends, the Whuppies. Call me on the museum storyline, 976-2233. Want to know how trains go, how chicks hatch, all about gravity, what makes the sky blue? I'll tell you a different story every day.
Or maybe you were looking to get your singing career kick-started. Well, you could do that with the help of whatever this is.
You can be in the Chuckles band, just singing to the telephone.
I'm gonna be in the Chuckles band. I'm gonna sing into the telephone.
That was fantastic. You really should be a recording star.
But by far the most popular 976 lines were the party lines, where multiple strangers came together in one virtual room to chat and, well, party, with the end goal being the chance of meeting someone in real life.
What's the number of that party line again?
Not that party line, the party line. 976.
8881.
976-8881. But I'm just gonna listen in.
It surprised me to learn that party lines were nothing new by the time the 1980s rolled around. In fact, they were about 100 years old by then. But they weren't exactly the same thing as the examples of 976 chat lines we've seen here. In the first several decades of the telephone, private lines were very expensive, mostly due to the sheer amount of physical material and work hours it took to install such a thing. So it was common for several households to share a line, reducing the price greatly. These were referred to as party lines. Well, back then, calls went through an operator who was sitting at a switchboard. The caller would pick up their line and dial the operator, who would then connect you to whoever you needed to be connected to. Kit from Knight Rider? Well, for the time, that would have been impossible. But yeah, let's go with Kit. So with the private line, you and Kit would share an exclusive line where the only one that could hear you would be Kit. And the operator too, if they felt like it. But it's basically a private line. With these so-called party lines, you still dialed the operator to connect you to Kit. But the difference would be, you probably weren't alone on that line. Because anyone at the time, from those dozen or so families that were sharing this line, could pick up their receiver and hear every single word shared between you and Kit. Of course, if you needed to make a call, you kind of had to eavesdrop. Even if you didn't want to, because there's only this one line available and you had to pick up your receiver to check if the line was open. So while you're busy yapping away to Kit about, I don't know, whatever you're talking to him about. Right, somebody else is trying to call their doctor or the police or something. So whether it was innocent and unavoidable or maliciously planned, listening in on other people was a major problem with these early party lines, except for when it wasn't. These party lines were especially popular in rural and farming areas, and it was fairly common pastime to pick up your receiver and see who might be up for a chat. It was a way to sit on a virtual porch with your neighbors and catch up, sort of like an old-timey chat room. You know, the farmers, they'd share pertinent information with each other. Maybe you give them a heads up about one of their cattle. You've seen it wandering around on your pasture or something. I don't know how, I don't know what farmers talked about. So while the term party line in this case referred less to this is a line for the party people and more to this is a line occupied by a large party of people, our next entry, 1988's party line, is all about the party people, if you get my drift. The next movie we're going to talk about, it's actually called Party Line, and it's just about one of these 80s adult chat lines. Party line concerns a brother and sister team with a peculiar relationship who like to call up the local 976 chat line and lure innocent people over. Right, they're not exactly innocent. They're actually all married guys looking to step out on their partners. So they're not entirely innocent. So let's just say unsuspecting people? Okay, so this brother and sister call up this chat line and lure unsuspecting people to meet them privately and in person. And it never ends well for said unsuspecting person. Angelina, played by Greta Blackburn, is the brains of the operation, if there is a brain at all, because most of these slangs don't require a whole lot of planning. And it's Angela's brother, Seth, played by child actor and 70s teen idol and heartthrob, Leif Garrett, that's wielding the straight razor. But why is this pair of siblings doing any of this to begin with? And why did I describe their relationship as peculiar? I'll answer that first by saying this. See, it's peculiar. Oh yeah, the sultry saxophone does seem to make saucy implications, and there's a lot of sultry saxophone in Party Line. It might have more saxophone than Lethal Weapon does. It's enough that you notice, and depending on how you feel about this riff, and other similar ones, you're either gonna hate it or really hate it. Now, as far as the question of these siblings' motives for doing these evil deeds, I think it's supposed to be some kind of reveal. So I don't want to spoil it here, because I want you to see this movie. The police officer that's assigned to the case is Lieutenant Bridges, played by Richard Hatch, who some might recognize from Battlestar Galactica. And helping Lieutenant Bridges with the case is an assistant DA named Stacy, played by Sean Weatherly, who was in a number of Baywatch episodes. I know you remember. Now, I guess in an attempt to add layers to the storyline of Party Line, they threw in a subplot involving a rivalry between Lieutenant Bridges and the city's DA. The DA thinks Lieutenant Bridges is too reckless, and Lieutenant Bridges thinks that the DA is a scumbag. So I guess this subplot tacks on a few more minutes. You know, it's there. More interesting to Big Head and I is the dad that gets roped into calling the Party Line after discovering someone else has been running up the phone bill calling this party chat line. And yeah, he is a gross dude. Not just because he refers to himself as Big Jack, but for other despicable reasons that make themselves apparent.
Yeah, I don't know about this Samson, but you haven't met Big Jack yet.
But as it turns out, Jennifer, the 16-year-old babysitter, she's been making calls to the Party Line while babysitting at Jack's place. Jennifer, who's played by Patricia Patz, is shown on the phone doing her best version of pillow talk with other presumably adult callers on the line. While Patricia Patz was actually closer to 21 while filming Party Line, she's still playing a 16-year-old. You know, so it's weird. But it gets weirder when you find out that Patricia Patz was the voice of Peppermint Patty and several Peanuts gang cartoons, which you can kind of hear when she speaks, so it feels sort of like...
I was curious. Are you as adventurous as you claim?
I could do things to you that would curl your toenails.
Sorry. Richard Roundtree is also in this movie as the captain in charge of the case, but if I'm honest, he feels a bit wasted in this role. I don't remember him kicking or punching anything, even once. Regardless, Party Line is an interesting watch, even if it feels less like the ultimate 80s slasher as Tubi refers to it, and more like a risque made-for-TV movie, because that is what it feels like. If it wasn't for the occasional cussing or the obligatory nude boob for an 80s slasher, this totally could have been a made-for-TV movie. Not that that's a bad thing, but if it was a made-for-TV movie, it would be one of several made-for-TV telephone terror movies. Now, we'll definitely eventually do a video on our favorite made-for-TV movies, where I'm sure we'll talk at length about our soft spot for made-for-TV horror movies. But for now, let's just say we like these movies because they were created with very little time and relatively little money. And because these movies were made for network television, they were under strict decency guidelines. So they couldn't show too much red stuff, you know, and there was a long list of words they couldn't say. But despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, made-for-TV horror movies always managed to entertain in one way or another. That was Are You Alone in the House, and it aired on CBS in September of 1978. And it's pretty much the genesis of the idea for this whole episode. Technically, I was reading Amanda Reyes' incredible compendium of made-for-TV movies, also called Are You Alone in the House? One thing led to another, and here we are. Now, concerning the movie, Are You Alone in the House? Right up front, I'll say it. It isn't a straight-ahead horror movie as much as it's a family drama with thriller elements. Not that the movie's subject matter isn't horrific, it is. Kathleen Beller plays Gail Osborne, a 17-year-old high school student who's been getting upsetting notes shoved into her locker by an unknown individual. That same individual is also making disturbing phone calls both to her family's home and to the home of the family of whom Gail occasionally babysits.
Are you in the house alone?
Now, all of this starts happening just as Gail starts dating Steve, who's played by Scott Colby. Could it be him behind all of this? Who knows, it could be. Or it could be the ex-boyfriend who's making snide remarks because he's seemingly jealous of Gail and Steve's relationship. Yeah, it could be the creepy photography teacher. Gail is a standout photographer at her school, and her photography teacher, played by Alan Fudge, who's very encouraging. He's like inappropriately encouraging.
Okay, Gail, why don't you try? Give us a sexy self-portrait, okay? Knock yourself out, sweetheart.
Yeah, well, that's not Alan Fudge's fault. He's playing a character. If anything, he's ruining the good name of teachers. Whoever the true culprit may be, the moment they walk through the front door and assault Gail is when Are You Alone in the House becomes a true horror movie. From that point on, Gail is forced to see this person every day, and the people around her that she should be able to count on to be there for her, they're all a bunch of jerks. For starters, when she first began receiving the notes in her locker, she tried to tell her high school counselor, who's played by Ellen Travolta, sibling to John, but the counselor responds by first asking if maybe Gail rejected a boy, maybe even without knowing it. This might be your fault, Gail. And her conclusion is, no one's coming after you, Gail, but I'll ask around. Then Gail's best friend accuses her of throwing herself at her attacker, again saying this was Gail's fault. But it's the response of Gail's parents that had me spinning in my seat. First, her dad, who's played by Tony Bill, gets angry, and that makes sense. But then somehow he immediately turns it around and makes it all about himself. He actually says, she's a part of me and I feel like this happened to me. And Mom, played by Blythe Danner, who's the real-life mom of actress Gwyneth Paltrow, tries to ease Dad's pain by reminding him that the doctor said she probably won't get pregnant, so what's the big deal, right? I mean, it's fine, right? When Mom later insinuates that the courts would never believe this terrible thing happened to Gail because she wasn't a virgin at the time, I almost turned it off. Yeah, well, yeah, you did walk out of the room, but that's because you used your litter box. Oh, and a pre-fame Dennis Quaid is in this movie. He's a slimeball too. Then there's Steve, Gail's new boyfriend. Now, he's pretty supportive, but before any of this even happens, he asks about and gets upset over what Gail and her ex-boyfriend did before, they were dating. So even the good guys here are sort of annoying. But the most annoying thing about Are You Alone in the House is how close to reality the conclusion is. If you're the type to talk out loud at the movies you watch, prepare to let out an exclamation. Speaking of endings that'll make you exclaim, the conclusion to our next made-for-TV movie terror might also cause you to talk to your TV. It'll probably be more of a questioning murmur than anything else. Now, if you are a fan of made-for-TV movies, you might agree that part of what makes them so fun is that they tend to utilize the television stars of the time in their production. This would allow you to see someone you saw in a very particular light, episode after episode of whatever show it may be, flex their acting chops in a way you'd never seen in an episode of that show. For example, I watched and loved John Ritter as the silly and affable Jack Tripper on Three's Company for years and years. There he was doing pratfalls and spit takes while cracking wise. admittedly facilitating gay stereotypes, but the general vibe was silly hijinks. But in 1986, he played a Vietnam vet dying from cancer brought on by exposure to Agent Orange and the TV movie Unnatural Causes. A little different, a little different than Jack Tripper. And then a few years later, John Ritter is desperately fighting to save his family from his wife's violent ex-boyfriend in the TV movie The Only Way Out. And to really throw your sitcom senses for a loop, that violent ex, he's played by the Fonz. So for a lot of people, much of the thrust of this next made-for-TV telephone terror was the actor playing the main character. That actor was... No, I think you're getting caught up on this, the Three's Company thing, Big Head. No, that actor was Robert Reed, or as he was best known, Mike Brady, the dad from The Brady Bunch. And that movie was 1975's The Secret Night Caller. That terrified woman is Charlotte, and she's played by character actor Arlene Golonka. We don't hear what's said to her on the phone, but it's bad enough to spook Charlotte into telling her co-workers down at the IRS office where she works. Meanwhile, Freddie, Robert Reed's character, who works in the same office as Charlotte as an IRS taxman, is feeling lost in the world. Freddie questions the nature of humanity, and we get to hear him think his thoughts.
What if madness is the true human condition? And we all use love and honor and goodness as a cover-up? What if a sane man is one whose madness hasn't yet been noticed? Oh, God, help me. Look how I twist and turn.
At work, he's dealing with clients trying to bribe them into letting them slide on their taxes. And at home, his wife, played by Emmy winner Hope Lang, tells him stories like this.
A man came into the shop and looked around for the longest time. I was a little nervous because I was alone, and he was giving me peculiar looks. He also had hairs in his nose. I hate that. Betty, why don't men trim the hair from their noses?
And then his daughter, who's played by Robin Matson, says stuff like this to him.
Hey, you know what? I think it's parents that have the sex hang-ups. Because with us, it's just, well, girls have what they have, and so do boys. Who cares?
Well, I don't think it's ever quite that simple.
That's beautiful. You're better than Mom. She talks about private parts. Dick.
Now, when Freddie finally manages to tell his wife how he feels, she tells him to go to sleep.
Do you ever feel lost?
You're tired.
Daddy.
Go to sleep, huh? Have a good night's rest.
Fortunately, David is voicing his concerns to a psychiatrist, played by Michael Constantine. Now, we learn that among Freddie's concerns are that he has vivid sexual fantasies that are happening mid-traffic light. Freddie also admits that he's considered eating spiders that he's seen in his garden. And listen, folks, I have mid-traffic light fantasies all the time, mostly about food. So that's not that big a deal, really. The eating spiders is more troubling for me. Yeah, I know. Perhaps to supplement those fantasies, we learn that Freddie has also been making visits to what was then definitely referred to as a gentleman's club. Yeah, Pour Some Sugar on Me was still years away. We find out that the dancer that we just saw there, played by Elaine Giftos, is also getting calls from a creep. And for reasons all her own, she seems to suspect that it's Freddie making them. And I think we're supposed to see Freddie's visits to this establishment as another result of his mental state. Which again, it's not that big a deal, depending. But then one evening, Freddy receives a call informing him that his co-worker, Charlotte, got another troubling call from this secret night caller. Now, this call was so disturbing that it caused her to go running out of her house and into her car and drive so erratically that she got into a really bad accident. Now, after visiting Charlotte in the hospital, Freddy is so overcome by guilt that he finally admits to a psychiatrist that he, as you probably already know, is the secret night caller. Now, I'm not spoiling it for you because it's pretty obvious, but also that's just the setup to the third act. And after admitting his wrongdoings to the doctor, it seems for a brief moment that Freddy's future is looking bright. But it's very short-lived. After a visit with his elderly mom, played by award-winning actress Sylvia Sidney, we soon learn some very disturbing things about Freddy's childhood. And it seems like a knot comes loose. Now, throw in the added stress of that previously mentioned dancer having tracked Freddy down as the secret night caller, and now she's blackmailing him for $10,000. Things are looking bleak for Freddy. Just a bunch of chickens are coming home to roost. But then, all of a sudden... Well, you know what? I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's a short movie, so it's worth a watch either way. If you're like a huge Brady Bunch fan, it's a must-see. I was just a casual viewer of the Brady Bunch, you know, and seeing Mike Brady giving women boozy-eyed glares and flipping furniture over out of anger was something else. Jerry Jameson, director of The Secret Night Caller, directed dozens of TV movies, including another telephone terror a few years later with 1982's Hotline. Like The Secret Night Caller, Hotline uses the popularity of a current TV star in the lead role, and this time it's Linda Carter of Wonder Woman fame. She plays a bartender named Brian. Her name is spelled like Brienne, but she and everybody else pronounces it Brian.
Hello, I'm Brian. Yeah, I know it's a guy's name. It's spelled different, though.
One night, a patron at the bar where Brian works sees how well she handles a situation with an aggressive drunk. He decides to recruit her to help at a crisis hotline, and she's immediately pretty good at it. So now Brian is splitting her time between helping people in crisis and slinging frosty mugs at the bar. And neither one is easygoing. At the bar, she's got an ex bugging her to take her back, and at the crisis center, she's got a creep who goes by the name The Barber, calling her with clues to crimes that he's committed.
Do the rhyme. Barber, barber, shave a pig. How many hairs will make a wig?
What does that mean?
Come now, Brian. Don't you read the papers?
It soon becomes clear that The Barber might actually be someone within Brian's social circle. But just who that is, you'll never guess. Or maybe you'll guess right away, I don't know. But the movie does throw some red herrings our way to keep things interesting. Hotline is arguably a better movie than The Secret Night Caller, at least in a traditional sense. Yeah, Frank Stallone, brother of Sylvester, is also in Hotline as Brian's bartender coworker, and he's fine. But seeing Wonder Woman being helpless against attackers, it doesn't have the same wallop as Mike Brady just losing it, you know? That said, Hotline is definitely worth a viewing, maybe a double feature with The Secret Night Caller. Well, so far, we've mostly discussed telephone terrors where the bad guys are distinctly human. But one made-for-TV telephone terror dared to dip its toe into paranormal territory.
Tonight on Tuesday Movie of the Week, Ben Gazzara, Elizabeth Ashley. Michael's been dead for 15 years. Now he's back to avenge his mother's death.
What is this?
When Michael Calls.
1972's When Michael Calls aired as ABC's Tuesday Night Movie of the Week. And in 1972, I gotta imagine there wasn't much else to do on a Tuesday night. I mean, I wasn't born yet, but I do remember Tuesday nights in 1982, and they were boring. Yeah, that's true. Maybe you had an Atari and all kinds of He-Man action figures, and you were up to your eyeballs in Rubik's Cubes or whatever, but I had 8 older siblings and a backyard full of dirt and some pecan trees. But my point is, Back when most people only had 3 or 4 channels to choose from, it was probably nice to have something to circle on the TV guide. And When Michael Calls certainly warranted a circling. As far as I can tell, its legacy is that of one of the better made-for-TV movies. It concerns Helen, played by Elizabeth Ashley, living with her young daughter, who one day starts getting mysterious phone calls. But these calls aren't from some perverted creep. Oh no, these calls are coming from her long-deceased nephew, Michael. See, 15 years ago, Helen made the difficult decision to institutionalize her sister after she suffered a mental breakdown. Helen then took her sister's 2 kids into her home to raise. It's then explained that young Michael ran away in the midst of a snowstorm and became lost. When all that was recovered of Michael was his jacket, it's presumed that he had perished, which left his brother Craig, played by a pre-famed Michael Douglas, to be raised by Aunt Helen. When Helen's friends and family try to tell her that these phone calls are probably just some cruel joke, Helen explains that this person addresses her in a way that only Michael would have known. He calls her Auntie My Helen.
Hello? Annie My Helen? What? Annie My Helen? I'm home and there's nobody here. Michael! I'm dead, aren't I? I'm dead! I'm dead!
Yes. Yes, they are. They're scarier than most of the calls that we hear in the other movies that we've discussed, if I'm honest. But for me, most of that fear comes from the idea that we're dealing with a spirit calling from the other side. But is that actually what's happening? I'm not gonna say anything. Maybe just that if you've seen any of these movies that we've discussed so far that feature a strange caller terrorizing people, you'll notice that a major ingredient is throwing red herring after red herring at the viewer. When Michael Calls is the only one that really had me fooled. Okay, I know we've been on made-for-TV movies for a bit now, and we'll get back to theatrical releases and video releases here in a minute, but there's one more made-for-TV telephone terror that I want to mention before we move on. And for those in the know, you might be thinking, he didn't mention 1978's Someone's Watching Me. I bet that's what he's going to say. And seeing as how it's a made-for-TV telephone terror made by horror legend John Carpenter, that's a pretty good guess. And because it is a John Carpenter film, you already know that it's probably better than your average made-for-TV movie, making it worthy of discussion. And while Someone's Watching Me was considered a lost film of John Carpenter's for a while, it's now widely available and it's pretty well covered. So no, that's not the movie I want to mention. Instead, I'd like to talk about a Canadian made-for-TV movie from 1989 called The Phone Call. Oh, Canada indeed. Considering the movies we've covered on this channel so far, it may surprise some of you to know that Big Head and I are not big proponents of the expression, "it's so bad it's good." We find it a bit condescending and fully nonsensical. I mean, if you find a film to be good for whatever the reason may be, then it's just good. There's no need to preface it with, "it's so bad." That said, we're making an exception this one time for The Phone Call. The Phone Call concerns a computer salesman named Michael, played by Michael Sarrazin. I'm unfamiliar with his work, but apparently his role in The Phone Call isn't typical of the gentle and sensitive characters he normally portrayed. I mean, listen to the opening line of his IMDb bio.
Owing a pair of the most incredibly soulful and searching eyes you'll ever find, Michael Sarrazin's poetic drifters crept into Hollywood unobtrusively on little cat's feet.
Yeah, little cat's feet. It doesn't get any gentler than that. And it's not that his character Michael is out and out brutal, but he's definitely meaner than he needs to be. At least initially. As I mentioned, Michael is a computer salesman, which in 1989 I imagine is a pretty tough gig. He's a seemingly devoted father and husband, not necessarily the kind of guy that you'd expect to be calling a late-night sex line. But despite that, his workmate, decides to show him something called the main line, an adult fantasy line.
I keep on doing it until... Oh! You are a pig.
By the way, that was there in the office at work that they made that phone call. Yeah, that's got to be against company policy. Also, earlier in the episode, when I said 976 chat lines were by far the most popular of the hotlines, these adult fantasy lines were probably just as popular when I think about it. Maybe even more popular. Either way, that phone call happens. And it's just taken as this sort of jocular incident between the fellas, you know. Now, previous to any of this, we briefly meet a guy named Carrie, played by Ron Lee, or it could be Ron Leah, who's been in a ton of stuff, but because it's all Canadian, I've never seen any of it. But his performance is really good, easily the best performance of the movie. So it's established that Carrie is of the criminal element. He hangs out in seedy bars with bad apples, and it's through one particular bad apple that Carrie seeks information on some kind of employment because he needs to make some money. That's when said bad apple tells Carrie about a job he thinks he can do. And the good news is, it's in the entertainment industry. I'm not sure if there is any bad news. At least there wouldn't be if this was, you know, just real life and not a Canadian made-for-TV movie. I mean, the job is for an adult fantasy phone line, so he's gonna be talking to strangers about their sexual fantasies. Probably in graphic detail at times. So depending on how you feel about doing something like that, seems like an okay job. Already you may know where this movie is headed, so let's get there. So now, we're shown computer salesman Michael in an intimate setting with his wife, played by Linda Smith. But it appears that he's passionless about the whole exchange, almost falling asleep on top of her. Could it be that he's preoccupied by something? Maybe thinking about this mainline sex chat line a little more than he thought he would? Yes, he most definitely is thinking about it a lot. And a few days later, when Michael is away on a business trip, alone and a bit tipsy in his hotel room, he decides he's going to call the main line. But as he flips through the phone book, because for some reason the sex line phone numbers are in the phone book and not on a late night commercial during a rerun of Barney Miller like they should be, he's having a hard time seeing. Right, because of the booze, you know? Being bleary-eyed drunk can have its consequences. In this case, those consequences are meaning to dial the main line to speak with a saucy lady, but accidentally dialing the man line, which deals exclusively in the business of saucy men.
Hello. My name's Carrie. What's yours?
Michael. I like that name, Carrie. It reminds me of a girl I used to go to school with. She'd only let me touch her if I gave her some candy. You've got a strange voice. It's kind of sexy.
I smoke too much.
Well, that's bad.
What are you going to do about it?
Yeah. So yeah, this is how our main characters cross paths. And it doesn't take Michael long to figure out that he dialed wrong.
Boy, that voice. I like it. You sound like one bad, sexy woman.
I'm not a woman.
Oh, really? Oh, what would you call yourself?
A man.
A what?
A man, Michael, but I can play along if you like.
And his reaction is less than positive.
Where am I calling?
The man line, Michael.
Man line? You mean... You sick bastard.
Michael is so traumatized about being turned on by a man that he has to wash his hands and then throw one back just to deal with it. While Big Head and I had a pretty good laugh about it, Carrie doesn't find it remotely funny. In fact, he's downright sick of being treated like a scumbag by his friends and his family. Now some stranger over the phone? He's not having any of this verbal abuse. So after spying Michael's personal information off of his boss's desk, Carrie shows up at Michael's hotel, insisting on an apology.
Can I help you?
Hello, Michael. Well, aren't you going to say hello?
Aren't you going to say hello?
Still, Michael refuses, but when Michael's workmate sees this exchange, he puts what he thinks is 2 and 2 together and assumes that his coworker Michael is gay. Now, the higher-ups are concerned at what might happen to the company's reputation should any of their clients find out that one of their salesmen is gay. I know it's a different time, but come on, it's the dawning of the 90s at this point. There are also some folks that have taken umbrage with the fact that because the character of Carrie is a gay man, he must also be a low-life criminal with psychopathic qualities. And I can see those people's point. But the whole thing is handled so objectively over the top that it transcends offensiveness and lands squarely in the territory of moronic hilariousness. From this point, it basically turns into Fatal Attraction, with Glenn Close's character swapped out for Carrie. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Carrie stalks Michael. He infiltrates his family and his home and eventually ixnays the family's pet, which in this case is a kitty, and it's revealed in a shocking manner, especially considering that this is a made-for-TV movie. If you're the type that can laugh in the face of offensively out-of-touch behavior that you'll sometimes find in these older films, The Phone Call is a can't miss. So all of these films that we've discussed so far fell under one of the fears that the earliest telephone users had. The fear of being tricked or manipulated by a stranger on the other end of the line. But what if the calls you're receiving aren't just an attempt to gaslight you? What if the noises you heard coming from the telephone were actually causing you to lose your mind? Hey, if you made it this far into the video, thanks a bunch. You're all right. Maybe you'll consider liking and subscribing or commenting and sharing this video, as it would really help us out. Okay, back to the telephone terrors. In Stephen Parker's book, Alexander Graham Bell and the Telephone, he makes mention that there were those who believed the sounds that came out of the telephone could cause a person to either lose their hearing or, worse, it could drive them completely insane. Some of this paranoia is the fault of the telegraph companies, who, at the time, were worried about being driven out of business by the telephone. But the idea of hearing such an unnerving sound coming out of the telephone that it steadily drives you mad is a frightening one. And that's exactly the situation in 1984's Disconnected. At least I'm pretty sure that's what's going on in Disconnected. I'll admit at times that I wasn't always clear on what exactly was happening in Disconnected. But I also think that was kind of the point. I'm pretty sure. Here's what it is. Disconnected falls into that oft-repeated description that many visually interesting films, especially indie horror films, fall into. And that's hallucinatory fever dream. Of course, sometimes words like hallucinatory and fever dreams are also just a polite way of saying confusing. But confusing is just a synonym for confounding, and as Big Head and I are fond of saying, no. Well, yes, I mean, I guess you could do that too. You as a cat shouldn't be doing that at all, but no, the answer I was looking for, we're fond of saying that confounding is as good as entertaining. Oftentimes, that head-scratching quality in a movie is achieved accidentally, through incompetence or inexperience, and other times it's achieved through unconventional thinking and free-spirited experimentalism. Either one works for us. But in the case of Disconnected, seeing as how the movie is about a woman losing her mind, it's possible, even likely, that the confounding nature of the movie was done on purpose. So we're going to chalk it up to unconventional thinking this time. And seeing as how Disconnected is director Gorman Bechard's first feature-length film, there's probably a fair amount of experimentalism inspired by inexperience. You know, that's fair, I think. It's difficult for me to describe the plot of Disconnected in a linear fashion, mostly because it feels a bit like 3 or 4 separate movies ran into each other at high speed and became fused together, and not necessarily in a cohesive way, but I'll do my best. Frances Raines plays Alicia, a movie buff that enjoys her job down at the local video store. She spends her free time hanging out at the club with her boyfriend and her twin sister, Barbara Ann, who's also played by Frances Raines. Yes, sort of like that, yeah. Recently, Alicia's been receiving these phone calls that start off as strange, but get progressively more disturbing as the movie goes on. Now, what's causing these troubling phone calls is hard to say. Very early on in the movie, we see Alicia approaching her apartment when she sees an older man who seems to be lost. Concerned for him, she escorts him up the stairs to her place and offers him some hot tea, maybe? And then offers her telephone so he can make a phone call, I think. I'm unsure exactly of what's said here because all of the dialogue is gone and it's replaced with music. So we just see, you know, lips moving and we only hear this song playing. So that's what we hear. But as you can see by the concerned look on her face, when she goes to look for the man, he's nowhere to be found. Maybe he went out the window? But they're a story up, you know, and he's nowhere to be seen. It's like he just disappeared. But he did use the phone, so maybe that was a ghost? And he somehow possessed the phone? And maybe that's the reason for the strange calls. So perhaps this is going to be a paranormal movie. Later, we see Alicia working at the video store when a fella named Franklin comes in, introduces himself, and they talk movies for a moment. But it turns out Franklin isn't there to rent a movie. He doesn't even have a VCR, or a video machine as they call it. That's when Franklin reveals this doozy.
To tell you the truth, I saw you at the bar last night. And, well, I guess you could call me a distant admirer.
Really?
Yeah, if someone approaches you claiming to be a distant admirer, that's your cue to run. But instead, Alicia seems fine with it, if just a bit distracted by her work. She's not even weirded out by Franklin when he starts questioning if that was her boyfriend that she was with last night. Soon Franklin leaves without incident, and Alicia just smiles the whole thing off. But the audience knows there's something odd about Franklin because, one, that's a strange and unnerving approach to asking someone out, I mean, even for the 80s. And two, there's ominous organ music playing the whole time Franklin is talking. Okay, so maybe Franklin is behind these calls? And this is going to be a stalker movie? Not a paranormal movie, despite the weird disappearing old guy? Okay, Franklin is played by Mark Walker, who's done lots of work in various TV shows and movies, including a bit part as a police officer in the previously discussed The Phone Call. No, but I'm not going to do that. That's not what we're going to do. I just thought it was strange, so I had to mention it. Inserted throughout Disconnected are shots of a detective being interviewed by an unseen person, sort of giving it a true crime documentary type feel. Okay, so this is a paranormal stalker movie, and it's also part true crime documentary. That's interesting. This is Detective Tremaglio, and he's on the hunt for a suspect who's been terrorizing women in the area. By the way, that area is someplace called Pine Hill in Connecticut. Disconnected was filmed in Connecticut, but in and around New Haven and Waterbury, which makes it a regional horror movie. Regional horror movies, if you're unfamiliar, they just refer to horror movies made outside of your typical movie-making places like LA or New York. Things filmed in places like Akron, Ohio, or someplace outside of Madison, Wisconsin. Big Head and I love regional horrors because they give you a small glimpse into a city or town you may otherwise never have a reason to go to. I mean, every time we watch the killer snake movie Jaws of Satan, it's like taking a virtual walking tour through beautiful Utah, Alabama, a place you probably didn't even know existed, unless of course you're from Utah, Alabama. Yeah, how else would we have ever done that? That's true. In the case of Disconnected, we see the quaint streets and small businesses in the area. Like the club they were in was a real New Haven club called Toad's Place. And the video store we see was a real video store in nearby Naugatuck, Connecticut. Naugatuck, Connecticut? I think I got that right. Possibly belonging to Carmine Capobianco, the actor who plays Detective Tremaglio, because the guy at some point did own 2 video stores. And then there's this place, an abandoned Bible-themed amusement park in Waterbury, Connecticut. It was called Holy Land, USA. That's a giant cross on a hillside near the sign for the place.
Well, since we found most of the bodies in the vicinity of Pine Hill, I think that chances are we'll also find the killer in the same area.
That scene, along with a few other really nice artful shots, are a good example of some of the dreamlike imagery that's littered throughout Disconnected. But what gives the film a fever dream-like quality is the seemingly disconnected nature of the story itself. Oh man, yeah, I didn't think of that until now. It could be. And this disconnected story, with mystery phone calls and disappearing elderly strangers and a wisecracking detective and some weirdo creeping around and admiring from far, gets another story disjointed wrench thrown in it when it's revealed that, well, it's more impactful if you just find out for yourself. Even though you probably already guessed who the killer is, the reveal is still pretty good. But even when you know who the bad guy is, you still don't know, or at least I didn't know, why these calls were happening. Are they even really happening? Alicia is certainly feeling the effects of them. One moment she's having a normal conversation, and then the next thing you know...
You don't know what I mean?
And it's not just strange noises that she's hearing on the telephone. It's also secret conversations between people she knows, like Alicia's boyfriend talking to her twin sister in a way he probably shouldn't be talking to her.
Look, I'm getting...
I had such a nice time last night. When can we do it again?
Barbara Ann?
I told you, I don't want to hurt Alicia.
That's not the impression I got last night. And besides, she doesn't have any idea what's going on between us. She never will.
Are these conversations real or just a product of the extreme stress Alicia is feeling from both the cacophonous phone calls and the very real suspicion she has regarding her boyfriend's relationship with her twin sister? At the end of Disconnected, if you have a clear idea of what just happened, you're either the movie's director, Gorman Bouchard, or you're a liar. Disconnected is visually fun to look at, and it's fun to ponder. Frances Raines, who's now Frances Sherman, is great in her dual performance as the independent yet vulnerable Alicia and as her self-involved twin, Barbara Ann. Frances Sherman was also in the classic slasher The Mutilator and in the bonkers Tim Kincaid feature Breeders, a favorite here at Movies with My Cat, so go check those out too. Also pretty good is Carmine Capobianco's performance as Detective Tremaglio. It feels amateurish, but in a charming way that really works. It sort of feels like we're talking to a cop.
Now, why do you wear those shirts?
I want to bring a little Tahiti into what the f***?
Capobianco and director Gorman Bouchard were partners in several films they worked on together, like cult favorites Psychos in Love and Galactic Gigolo. Later on, Gorman Bouchard would go on to write several well-received novels and a handful of awesome documentaries. It's his documentaries that make me believe that had I grown up in Connecticut instead of Texas, Gorman and I would probably be pretty good pals. Anyone that loves animals, pizza, and the replacements enough to make documentaries about them, he's a pretty good guy in my book. He's made several music documentaries all about cool bands, so it's no surprise that there was an emphasis on music throughout Disconnected. Now, one other perk of these regional horror films, speaking of music, is the use of regional bands. In this case, it's a band from Connecticut called The Excerpts, led by future producer, session player, composer extraordinaire John Bryan, who went on to award-winning acclaim. But with The Excerpts, who we actually get to see perform in the movie, we're dealing more with, they kind of sound like a discount, the Thompson Twins.
There's nothing I could do to try to make it through, 'cause you don't love me.
Well, of course you liked it. If you didn't know, Big Head is the self-proclaimed king of the new wave cats. It's a long story. While you'd probably call being driven mad by sounds coming through the telephone an irrational fear, this next concern, shared by early telephone naysayers, it was sort of a reasonable one. As mentioned earlier, the installation of a switchboard and working phone lines in a town involved a lot of equipment, a lot of electrical equipment. So it's understandable that electric shock was a major concern to some, especially if you had relatively little understanding of how exactly electricity worked. An article in The Atlantic cites an account from The New Yorker circa 1933 that read, "They were afraid that if they stood near one in a thunderstorm, they might get hit by lightning. Even if there wasn't any storm, the electric wiring might give them a shock for some reason." And let me say, I've experienced an electric shock from a phone line as a 15-year-old boy, and it's not great. I was trying to DIY repair our touch-tone phone so I could call my cousin to see if he wanted to go to the mall with me because I wanted to go to Musicland and buy Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins on cassette tape. Yeah, that's a very 90s sentence. But it's true. I put the phone line, which was attached to the wall, in my mouth to strip the wire, and it felt like somebody slapped me from the inside of my mouth. It really hurt. It wasn't fun. But it was nothing compared to the electric shock the people in our next film received. That film is Bells from 1982, or Murder by Phone as it's also known. I believe Murder by Phone was a bit longer and Bells was a cut version of Murder by Phone, but I'm just going to refer to it as Bells because Murder by Phone is a bad name. Bells was directed by Michael Anderson, who's maybe best known for directing 1957's Around the World in 80 Days, and later the 1976 sci-fi classic Logan's Run. Mr. Anderson was born in London, but he became a Canadian citizen the year before Bells came out, which means Bells is a Canadian production. Big Head, he can't help it. He's from Texas, and it seems Texans can't help but make fun of Canadians. I love Canada. Poutine, legal marijuana, what's not to love? And I'd like to visit someday, but for now, watching Bells will have to do. So the movie opens up with a woman walking in a Toronto subway station when she hears a ringing payphone nearby. She then makes the decision to answer it. Now, if you're a bit younger and your experience with payphones is limited or even possibly non-existent, answering a ringing payphone is kind of strange. Unless you specifically ask someone to call that payphone at that particular time, that call is not for you. There's no reason to pick it up. And at best, it's a prank call or a pervert or something like that. At worst, well, at worst, it's the last phone call you'll ever take. At least that's the case with this ringing payphone in this subway station. When she picks it up, there's a sound like a dial tone. But then that tone starts to climb in frequency. As it does, the woman begins to shake like she's experiencing a seizure. Then blood begins to come out of her eyes and nose. There's a loud explosion and a bright blast of light as she's thrown several feet onto the subway escalator where she meets her end. We soon learn that this woman was a former student of one Dr. Nat Bridger, a professor of electronics of some sort. He's also an environmentalist. Nate Bridger is played by Richard Chamberlain, who has several Emmy nominations and a couple of Golden Globes, and a bunch of other awards. He's a tad classier than most actors I encounter while covering these movies, and he's pretty good here too as Nat Bridger. When Nat visits the family of his former student, the grieving father says he thinks it's weird that the official cause of death for his healthy 19-year-old daughter is a heart attack. As it turns out, Nat is headed to Toronto to speak at a seminar, so he's happy to get her belongings and ask a few questions on the family's behalf. We're then shown a series of similar attacks on unsuspecting people answering the phone. One guy, it seems, did whoever was on the other side of that phone line wrong, because we hear him say,
Smith, you stole it from me, Gordon. It should have been mine.
And then this guy gets zapped right out of the building, office chair and all. So it seems like we have a madman getting revenge on people who've wronged him, and he's doing it via an electric shock through the telephone line. Well, I'm saying people who've wronged him, but literally one woman appears to get zapped just for informing him that the bank was closed for the day and he'd have to come back tomorrow.
You don't know what it's like to be kept waiting.
Hey, are you weird or...
Yeah, that's not zap-worthy. It really isn't. So Nat Bridger, he believes that the phone company knows more about these deadly payphone zaps than they're letting on. And the more he pokes around, the more suspicious he gets. Nat can't help but think there's more going on than meets the eye. But I get the feeling that Nat probably thinks this about a lot of things in the world, because it's implied that he's sort of a conspiracy, let's say a conspiracy believer. Nat is willing to do anything to get the truth, including things I wouldn't necessarily associate with an environmentalist professor from a Canadian university. You know, he's destroying public property with a pair of bolt cutters. He's choking a suspicious photographer and smashing up his camera. He's even fine with grabbing a police lieutenant by the collar and shoving him up against the wall. To heck with it, Nat. You know what? Go ahead and fight a couple of cops, too. But mostly Nat is sleuthing, and helping him with this sleuthing is his mentor, Professor Stanley Markowitz, who's played by Oscar winner John Houseman, another actor who's way classier than we're used to dealing with here at Movies with My Cat. Now, Professor Stanley Markowitz, in addition to being Nat's mentor, is also, conveniently enough, the environmental consultant for the phone company, because Professor Stanley is also, like Nat Bridger, an environmentalist. So that might come in handy. Rounding out Nat's investigating team is Lieutenant Mara, the fella previously seen getting chumped by Nat. Yeah, it's a whole thing, you know, but they work it out and work together. And then there's Ridley Taylor, played by Sarah Botsford. Now, Ridley Taylor is an artist working on a mural for the telephone company. Nat and her meet in the lobby of the building, and they end up going on a date. It didn't seem like that great of a date, honestly.
Oh, I forgot. You think that the police are part of the cover-up?
And I forgot. You work for them.
Must be a real pain in the ass going through life thinking that there's a Watergate behind every closed door.
It's worse when you find out there really is.
But despite this mediocre date, she still offers to give Nat access to diagrams, blueprints, and even a tour of the lab.
Look, they want a mural. They give me free access to anything that I want. Photographs, diagrams, blueprints, tours of labs. It's all there for the asking.
She's an artist doing a mural in the lobby of the building, and somehow that entitles her to blueprints and tour scheduling. I'm not sure why. Perhaps. The closer to the truth Nat gets, the closer to danger he puts himself and those around him. Can he crack the case before the entire city of Toronto gets zapped into oblivion? Bells is definitely worth the watch to find out. The cast is genuinely good, especially John Houseman, who I wish had twice as much screen time.
Perhaps Mr. Markowitz could answer your question. Did you hear the question, Mr. Markowitz?
I did. Electrical energy can do things that fiber optics cannot.
For instance, Mr. Markowitz.
Fiber optics cannot ring a bell.
Wow, really?
The music is also pretty great. It was a synthesizer score done by the legendary John Barry, another guy with awards coming out of his ears. And where the music works best is in conjunction with the worry the audience feels every time a telephone rings. Is it a friend calling to say hi? Or is it the mad phone zapper of Toronto? That's not what they call him in the movie, but yeah, they should have. Another thing I thought was kind of neat about bells, it dares to wade deep into the waters of the technical side of the telephone.
You know anything about electrical flashback?
Of course. We've got couplers hooked into the system to guard against vaporizing the ESS.
Exactly. But if Clayton hasn't bothered to install couplers on his system, then we can redirect sound and voltage back to the point of origin.
It's nice to see all those years behind books paid off.
Bells also reminded me of a term I haven't heard in a very long time.
Oh, hell, you wouldn't hardly believe it. Some turkey must have taken a flamethrower to the receiver.
Just the receiver, huh?
Yeah. There wasn't even a mark on the box there. Don't hardly make sense.
Could it have been the voltage? Maybe something in the electroacoustic transducer.
You some kind of phone freak?
Phone freak. That's freak spelled with a PH, of course. No. Well, there's probably some crossover there, but no. The term phone freak refers to a subculture of people devoted to learning everything about the phone system, usually to exploit it in some way. You know, they could whistle a particular, tune, a frequency, and they'd get free calls from payphones or free long distance. Think of them as the computer hackers of the telephone world. One of the most appealing things about bells is the amount of subgenres it could reasonably fall under. It's a telephone terror, obviously, but bells also falls under the banner of Canucksploitation. It's a Canadian horror movie. That's the only qualifier to make it a Canucksploitation. But it could also be an eco-horror, what with the main character being an environmentalist, that clearly hates the phone company. Finally, bells could fall under the subgenre of films based on a book. For our purposes, yeah, let's say it is. And Bells is based on a book. It's based on the 1979 book Phone Call by John Messman. But as it turns out, John Messman is just the collective pen name for Michael Butler and Dennis Chirac, the screenwriters for Bells. Incidentally, Dennis Chirac went on to write Turner and Hooch.
All right. You tell me what I'm supposed to do. You tell me what I'm supposed to do. What am I supposed to do? You tell me. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do, Hooch? Am I supposed to stand out on the porch all night long?
So I guess I'm a Dennis Chirac fan. While Bells was based on a novel, our next and final telephone terror was based on a commercial. Kind of.
You want to hear a good scary story? I tell good ones. Where's the phone now?
The idea of calling up a number and having some kind of monster or devil pick up on the other side is one that was very much exploited in the late 80s.
From the Fright Line, 976-4200. Call if you dare, 976-4200.
If you saw my last video, thanks for watching. If not, check it out. Link in the description. But we essentially had some fun looking at various commercials for spooky pay-by-the-minute hotlines. It was mostly spooky stories and other mystical things.
Nice cat. Perhaps Annie Oakley? And look at him, why it's Napoleon. Reincarnation. What human being was your pet in a previous lifetime?
Now in the 1980s, these hotlines were just kind of a fun and silly way to kill time and fatten up your phone bill. But in the dawning of the new age of the telephone, such a concept might have been looked at as tempting a very real and horrifying fate. The 1977 book, The Social Impact of the Telephone, had this to say about early public demonstrations of the telephone. I'm just going to read this little part out of this book. In 1877, when Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson were giving public demonstrations for the telephone in New England and New York, the newspaper reports were full of forebodings of witchcraft. It is difficult, said the Providence Press, to really resist the notion that the powers of darkness are in league with it. The Boston Advisor spoke of a weirdness never before felt in that city. And the New York Herald found the telephone, quote, almost supernatural. Hearing that, it's no wonder that some people at the time believed it was possible that telephones were capable of unleashing evil spirits into the world. So perhaps it was this antiquated and frightening idea that inspired the makers of our next and final telephone terror, 1988's 976 Evil. It'd be a way cooler origin story. But no, that's probably not what inspired 976 Evil. It's way more likely that the writers of 976 Evil were just up late one night and they saw one of these 976 commercials and they thought like, hey, is that enough for a movie? Is that something? But I thought it was interesting that people back then, even so-called educated people, were worried that their telephones might possess them. There's still people today that are worried about that. I've read the Quora discussions. Regardless of how the creators of 976 Evil got there, the idea of simply dialing a number and losing all agency to a demonic force, it's enough to ruin anyone's day. Okay, so 976 Evil, it's a movie with a huge name in horror attached to it, but probably not in the way you'd expect. Robert Englund, of course, best known for portraying Freddy Krueger, was instead behind the camera as the director of 976 Evil. It was his directorial debut. Not that he directed much else. Other than 976 Evil, Robert Englund directed 2 episodes of the Nightmare on Elm Street based TV series Freddy's Nightmares, and then he directed something in 2008 called Killer Pad. When 976 Evil came out, it was largely panned by critics, and that's likely why we don't see Englund directing too often. But 976 Evil eventually picked up a cult following. Now, some of that following, no doubt, came from Robert Englund's name being attached. But most of the cult is following Stephen Jeffries, who was absolutely top-notch weird as Evil Ed and Fright Night. In 976 Evil, Jeffrey plays an equally quirky high schooler named Hoax, who lives under the thumb of his domineering mother, who's like a religious zealot type. This makes home life tough for Hoax. And it doesn't get any better at school, as he's a perennial punching bag for the group of bullies that hang out in the bathroom. His one saving grace is his cousin Spike, who's played by Patrick O'Brien. Now, Spike's been living with his mousy cousin Hoax and his fire and brimstone Aunt Lucy ever since Spike's mom passed away. And that's extra tough for Spike because, and maybe you can tell from the name, Spike is sort of a cool motorcycle daddy-o who doesn't play by the rules. Yeah, that's true. Spike does like to play the cards, and sometimes he loses. Spike also hangs out with a bad crowd. In fact, it's those same bullies that hang out in the bathroom that pick on Hoax. And you can tell they're bad dudes because they look like a mashup of Judd Nelson's character from The Breakfast Club and any given extra from a West Side Story dance fight scene. So after losing the title to his Harley Davidson in a card game, Spike is lying in bed reading a magazine and, I imagine, thinking of a way to come up with money to not lose his motorcycle. That's when a mysterious card falls out of his magazine with the number 976 Evil advertised on it. Spike dials it, and initially it just seems like a typical horoscope hotline, but he did have to dial 666 to get to his horoscope, and the voice on the line was ominous sounding.
Welcome to the caverns of the unknown. I am the master of the dark, the guide to your destiny on
November 28th, 1988.
That voice tells him that his recent financial troubles are coming to an end. This seemingly gives Spike the idea to steal money from his aunt. Technically, it's Spike's money, or at least it's money that his mom left for him, but his aunt is using it all up. So it's not really stealing, but that's not how Aunt Lucy sees it when she catches him in the act. Soon after this, it starts raining fish. Yeah, could have been a salmon or maybe some kind of a mackerel. I don't know fish names, but yeah, it rained fish. Now, while Aunt Lucy sees this as a sign from God to lead Spike back to the righteous path, Spike thinks it's super weird, because it is. But things get even weirder for Spike when, instead of calling that ominous voice at 976 Evil, it starts calling him. And it tells him to do stuff. Ungodly stuff. You know, like, hey, why don't you go steal those leather gloves over there in that shop? You don't got to pay for them. Just go get them. Come on, go ahead. Now, realizing that there's something definitely weird about that horoscope hotline, Spike defies the voice and says, no, nuh-uh. No more. Not today. I'm not doing it. And the voice responds to this by trying to run him over with a car. But the good news is Spike is safe and he's done with calling 976 evil. Unfortunately, Hoax is just about to fall into the same trap. That's because Hoax, who's in awe of Spike's coolness, is snooping around Spike's room one evening when he comes across the same ad for 976 Evil. Yeah, he found he found some underwear. He found the underwear of Spike's girlfriend Susie. And then he just kind of handles them for a while. And he takes the underwear with him. And it's pretty clear Hoax has a thing for Susie. But if that was the only bad choice Hoax had made, snooping around Spike's room, things might have ended well. It still wouldn't be great. You know what I mean? It's weird, right? But it wasn't the only bad choice he made. Hoax decides to call the number on the card. And the same ominous voice gives him advice. And then he follows it. And the vicious cycle that threatened to consume Spike is now gaining control over Hoax. And the more he surrenders his will to the voice on the phone, the more powerful Hoax becomes. And the more powerful Hoax becomes, the crazier looking it gets. Can Spike bring Hoax back from the brink of destruction? And can Hoax be stopped before he destroys not only those who have wronged him, but those that care the most for him? Like I said, 976 Evil gets a lot of flack, and some of it's deserved. For instance, it has characters that seem like afterthoughts that aren't really needed to move the story along, like the private investigator who's there looking into the strange goings-on, or the high school principal that he somehow drags into the whole thing. Another knock is that it takes too long for the ball to get rolling in 976 Evil. And while it does take half the movie before the carnage begins, once it gets there, it's super fun. Exactly, true. Have a little patience, you know? And it's not like you're bored that whole first half. I mean, you're hanging out with some pretty interesting characters. Hoax is fun to root for as a meek and mild kid just trying to make his way through the world. And Stephen Jeffries plays him perfectly. Sympathetic as a bullied kid and terrifying as a demonic force. And Aunt Lucy, who's played by Oscar winner Sandy Dennis, is properly unhinged as a religious fanatic with a bunch of cats. Whoa! Whoa! Spoiler alert, big head. Well, it's out there now, so yeah. Aunt Lucy, she gets eaten by her pack of cats. A fate that a surprising amount of cat owners are fine with, myself included. You know what's funny? It wasn't just Aunt Lucy that loved cats. Sandy Dennis also loved cats, maybe even more than Aunt Lucy. In fact, before she passed, her home in Westport, Connecticut was full of cats. So many cats, in fact, that it actually affected her relationship between her and her then fiancé, Eric Roberts, the actor Eric Roberts. Now, he claims that she had upwards of 100 cats on the property. When he suggested that it might be best to get these cats to an animal shelter, Sandy refused. And then he offered to open a sanctuary just for these kitties. But still, Sandy said, no thanks, I like them here with me. And this ended their relationship. So that's some serious cat loyalty. But you know, Stephen Jeffries, he's the real reason to watch 976 Evil. I think he's great. But he's had a strange career trajectory. He did stage work early on, and he was quite good. He even earned a Tony Award nomination. And then he made a few Hollywood movies, you know. But pretty soon, after 976 Evil, the titles of the films on his IMDb page got pretty interesting. You know, let's see, as a matter of fact, just looking at him here, I see there's something called Tell Me Something Dirty. Okay. Could just be a raunchy 80s comedy, you know. Stephen Jeffries did those too. Then there is Mechanics by Day, Lube Jobs by Night. Okay, well, maybe it's a racing movie, you know, of some kind. Those were pretty popular in the 80s, you know, Tom Cruise, Days of Thunder. Let's see, what else? Then there is Latin crotch rockets. Leather After Midnight, Leather Buddies, Butt Blazers. Here you go. Butt Machine Boys. Yeah. So Stephen Jeffries started making hardcore adult films, you know, for a little while. Just a whole bunch of them. Now, I did read several things speculating on why Stephen Jeffries' career took this unexpectedly adventurous turn. Some say it was because the offers for the mainstream film stopped coming in. Others said there may have been some substance abuse issues and a need for fast cash. Now, if that's the case, I hope Stephen Jeffries is healthy and okay these days. I did see that he got back into more mainstream stuff again in 2007 and even made an appearance on a podcast this year. So that's promising, you know. So let's go, Stephen Jeffries. So those were a few telephone terrors that tried to spook us. I imagine these would be life-shatteringly terrifying, you know, to those people of the 1880s that were alive to witness the dawning of the telephone. Not that we're much different now, you know, than we were 140 years ago. You know, Big Head and I are fully aware that some people are still terrified of their smartphones, which I'll admit makes more sense than being worried about getting phone calls from Satan. Well, all right, we hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe. And if you have a moment, maybe leave a comment down below. Like I mentioned before, this is definitely not a complete list of telephone terror movies, so if there is one that you know of that you think Big Head and I would really like, let us know in the comments. That'd be awesome. And finally, if you haven't already seen these movies, check them out. Better yet, watch them with a friend. Big Head, as always, thanks for hanging out and watching these movies with me. And thanks a bunch to you guys, too, so much. All right, everyone, we'll see you in the next episode of Movies with My Cat.
I'll call you.